Akoto was the figurehead for Ashanti succession.
Figurehead for Ashanti secession.
Ashanti secession.
Secession.
Yeah.
As
the agitation for secession that later morphed to the agitation for federalism in the run-up to Ghana's independence.
Perhaps if you can take us through exactly what happened that brought him into the limelight. You said there was an agitation for secession. There's a bit of detail.
There's a fundamental problem, and that is profound ignorance about our history. Now, we must start from the formation of the Gold Coast. Now, the Gold Coast started as, call it a protection pact between a number of fancy states and the British. And what was the issue? These states were under threat by Ashanti, who were interested in control of the coast for the purpose of controlling the slave trade. That was how the bond of 1844 came into being. Which is the origin of the British Gold Coast. Right? Later, other coastal states joined the Gold Coast. So the Gold Coast came to stretch from our current border with the Côte d'Ivoire to our border with Togo, which was then under German control. Or it came under German control shortly after. The Gold Coast did not include Ashanti. It did not include Achim. It did not include Kwewu. Did not include what are today the Northern Territory. Sorry, the Northern region. Savannah, Northeast, Upper East, Upper West. It did not include vast parts of today's Volta region. It did not include the OT region. The Gold Coast started as I said, a protective pact between the British and the coastal states. How did they arrive? The British found that because of rising industrialization in the metropolis, they no longer needed slaves from the Gold Coast, but they had abolished the slave trade. So the seizure of all slave cargoes, I mean, the trade was banned. And to trade in slaves, you needed access to the ports on the coast. Elmina, Cape Coast, you can name them, all the ports along the coast. That was what brought the bond of 1844 into being, and the British Gold Coast was formed. over time, the Gold Coast will expand. Asante became part of the Gold Coast after it had lost to the British. I mean, there are a number of wars between the Asante and the British. I'm sure you know about the Sargenti War, right? I'm sure you know about the Battle of Mr. Manco. Okay. I think it was after the third battle, the British managed, by virtue of superior technique, to vanquish Asante. And Asante became part of the Gold Coast colony, I believe, in 1901. I'm sure you also know about the battle, the contestation between Asante, led by Yasantua, right? At issue was a very simple matter. Asante controlled the slave trade by virtue of its location. He needed access to the coast to export, and the banning of slavery was a profoundly hostile act that threatened the existence of the kingdom. So that's what brought Asante and the British into conflict. And this laid at the heart of the founding of what we now know as Ghana. So I don't need to go over this again, do I?
No, that's clear.
Good. So going forward, in 1901, Asante was incorporated into the colony. The Asante Nini had been exiled. You know about that as well, right? Good. Then you had other additions to what we now call Ghana. The Northern Territory came in by way of treaties between the British and the French, and I believe the Germans on one side, and the group, the ethnicities in that part of our country agreed to join the British. Now, current Walter Togoland, which was part of German Togoland, became part of, or it was administered as part of the British Gold Coast after the Versailles Conference in 1919, following the First World War, when German territories were seized. In this case, the German territory of Togoland was partitioned between the British and the French. So that's why you have the four component parts of what became Ghana. Okay? Now, so we are at the beginning of agitation for independence. The United Gold Coast Convention had been formed in 1947. We can go into the motivations that went into its formation, starting from the death of Oforiatta I, the ritual murder, the trial, the execution of the murderers, and the central involvement of J.B. Dankwa. That the UGCC was formed in 1947, and a member of the UGCC, Akwaje, when we're looking for general secretary. Says, you know what? I have this friend who was a colleague in the U.S. in I believe Lincoln University. He was Akwaje's roommate when he was studying for law. He had been at the heart of the Pan-African movement, the Pan-African Congress in Manchester in 1945. He had been at the heart of drafting the communique on the independence of the colonized people. It was Kwame Nkrumah. So Akwaje recommended to his colleagues, Dankwa, Awano, Rena, Agra, and the rest, that if they needed someone who could do the work of the general secretary, they had a perfect candidate, Kwame Nkrumah. So they invited Nkrumah. He did not initially want to come. He in a sense, he knew the forces who were behind the agitation and who were behind the formation of the United Gold Coast Convention. Nkrumah was looking and working for a more radical agenda. That was a Pan-African agenda, starting with the West African colonies of the colonial powers. So he did not want to get involved in the Gold Coast project. It was Nkrumah's friends, mostly you might call them West Indian, but these are people from the Caribbean. Padmore, James, and co, who insisted that Nkrumah come, and as it is said, you want to change the world, you must start from someplace, not so. So they said, you know what, you can start this project from Ghana. So the project that Nkrumah came to work on in Ghana was a Pan-African project, which is why he would go on to state on the eve of Ghana's independence that the independence of Ghana was meaningless unless it was linked up with the total liberation of the African continent. I'm sure you know this as well. Sure. That's why context is important in all of these matters, so that we understand where we are and where we have come from and how far we have to go. So fast forward, Nkrumah comes. He transformed the United Gold Coast Convention from a gentleman's club that will meet and drink tea and have coffee and send petitions to the Queen, or in this case to the King. He transformed it into the first mass political movement on the African continent. From just this activity of gentlemen, lawyers, and merchants of business meeting and complaining about their subservient rule under the British, that was only confined to Stockholm, Accra, and Sekondi. Nkrumah has transformed the United Gold Coast Convention into a countrywide movement agitating for independence. But that was not the original project that the founders of the UGCC set up to achieve. This was what brought them in direct conflict with Nkrumah. what Nkrumah had done was to bring in the people. What the UGCC set out to do was not for the people of the Gold Coast, per se. So for a limited group of people, the so-called educated elite and the merchant princes, who were under the double yoke of the colonialists, the British, and the chiefs, who in many cases, they were illiterate fathers, uncles, grandfathers. I don't know whether I've succeeded in painting an accurate picture of what the situation was in the Gold Coast. British colonialism was a joint venture between the colonialists and the chiefs through this so-called indirect rule. So to overthrow British colonialism was also to overthrow the rule of chiefs. Now, in all this contestation, when the fight became the issue for the independence of the enlarged Gold Coast, which has now come to include Akyem, Kwewu, Asante, the Northern Territory, and now Transvolta Togoland. Of course, these constant parts also felt that they had a say in what would be the final settlement. Not so. Not so. Yes. So, Asanteman asserted itself. And by Asanteman, I mean the old Asante Empire, which was comprised of today's Asante region, large parts of the central region, and Bongahafo. They fought to assert themselves. They wanted, as far as they understood, if it was independent, then they wanted a restoration of their old empire. I hope you are following the point I'm making.
They wanted a restoration of the empire.
If the British are going away,
okay,
you've come and taken over our land. If they are going away, give us back our land.
Oh, okay.
And for Santiman, their land included their colonies on the coast.
The colonies on the coast, which will be the central region.
Specifically Elmina.
Oh, okay.
And some other parts. But basically, they were in contestation for control of the coast. You can take it from Anglo to Nzima. Because as an empire founded on the business of exporting slaves, if you had no access to the coast, you were doomed. But you know, and mind you, I'm saying that this was the impetus for the establishment of the Gold Coast from the very beginning, for the signing of the bond of 1844. It was a protective bond, it was a protective agreement between the British and the Asante states, I think 13 of them in the beginning, who were threatened by Asante power. And I'm saying that the central contestation was about the slave trade. Asante, through its control of the slave trade, had become rich and powerful. Now, another power says that it is abolishing the business that is the source of your well-being and your power. Are you going to sit and allow that to happen? No. That is what brought the war between Asante and the British. That's what led to the conquest of Ashanti and its incorporation into the Gold Coast, and the subsequent expansion of the Gold Coast to include the Northern Territories and then to include Transwater Togoland after the defeat of Germany and the division of German Togoland. So the point I'm making is that the agitation for independence that Nkrumah started first, within the UGCC, it brought him in conflict with the originators of the UGCC. Was on the point of being expelled. He almost had come to an accommodation with those who had invited him, because they had asked that he disband the youth movement. Instead, what happened was that it was the youth of the Gold Coast who dragged Nkrumah out of the UGCC and into the CPP. Nkrumah was at that point willing to come to a compromise with people who were of the same social standing as he himself. They are all Bintus. They are part of the educated elite. Kofi Baku, Kobodusei, Victor Usu, Aram Ponsa, and I'm going over these names deliberately because the Ashanti youth were at the heart of the Gold Coast youth, and they are the heart of the agitation for independence. So it was the youth of the Gold Coast who said no to Nkrumah, and the shabby compromise was about to reach with his colleagues in the UGCC.
Okay.
And they said that, look, Nkrumah should give up his post as General Secretary and become Treasurer. And they said, look, if you are not fit to become General Secretary, how can you be fit to become Treasurer of the same movement? Are you with me, Sena? Yes.
Okay.
So it was the youth of the Gold Coast, Jenklejewu, Kobodusei, Aram Ponsa, all the names. I mean, there's so many. I can't name them. Provincial. They dragged Nkrumah almost against his will from the UGCC into the CPP.
Okay, Doc. Let's jump to the point where you're talking about what the Ashantis really wanted out of independence.
They wanted their old empire back. Simplicity. In 1992, I'm sure you heard this famous war cry, GPD.
Yes.
Did you hear it?
Yes.
Yes. They want their empire back. And the empire includes all the vassal states,
Mm-hmm.
and their colonies on the coast.
And I guess from what you said earlier, you said Okyeame Baffour Akoto was the figurehead, became the figurehead of this movement.
Yes, he was just a figurehead for Santiman.
So he was not really someone who was interested in the independence of the entire Ghana. He wasn't fighting for that. What he was fighting for
was for Santiman. And why not? Sena, I'm sure you come from a part of this country.
Yes, I do.
Don't you?
Yes, I do.
If you are representing that part of this country in a larger conversation, whose interest will you be fighting for?
Of course, where I come from.
This is politics 101.
Then, where is the connection to the NLM issue?
The NLM became the political movement for Ashanti independence, or for Ashanti restoration. And by restoration, it meant the restoration of the old empire that had been taken over by the British.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
This thing cannot be difficult to understand.
So it was not a political party that was interested in taking over Ghana.
No, it was interested in taking over Ghana to the extent that those parts of Ghana were part of the empire. Ghana had not been formed. The people of this landmass, the Gold Coast, made up of these constituent parts I have named. The original Gold Coast. That started out with the anti-state and the bond of 1844. That expanded to include all the coastal states from Anglon to the western boundary. Okay? That did not include Okyeame. That did not include Kwewu. And that did not include Ashanti, Bono Ahafo, and the Northern Territory.
Well, Doc, having said that, if there's a celebration of Okyeame Baffour Akoto, essentially, what are we celebrating?
It's a celebration of Ashanti resurgence and an agenda for hegemony.
Ashanti resurgence.
That's simply put, yes.
Because he has been described as a statesman.
Because, you see, the point is this. That is why, our friends in power have been most successful in bastardizing and rewriting our history. In the process, hiding their criminal past. Now, so let's go back to the beginning. Baffour Akoto was the chief linguist of the Asantehene. He was the chief linguist of the Asantehene. He has a movement called the National Liberation Council. Can you exclude the National
Liberation Movement actually, yeah.
Well, of course, I said council because the National Liberation Movement transformed itself into the NLC in 1966 with the overthrow of Nkrumah. So we have tried the shift. But we can talk about that later. But let's go back to the beginning. So the Ashanti youth have become the most vibrant part of the CPP. Right? You remember the point I made? That was the Gold Coast youth, spearheaded by the Ashanti youth, that had dragged Nkrumah, literally screaming and kicking, into the CPP, out of the UGCC. That singular action led to the collapse of the UGCC. It became just an empty shell. Because when Nkrumah was dragged out of the UGCC into the CPP became the movement of the Gold Coast masses. And the UGCC just became an empty shell. It will subsequently collapse into its ethnic and other fragments, but we can talk about that later. But in 1954, but this happened in 1949, right? Nkrumah contested the first general elections in 1951. The UGCC was an opponent. Like I said, out of 34 seats, I believe Nkrumah won. Nkrumah and the CPP won 31. Right? The three were split up between the remnants of the UGCC and I believe the people in the north. I can't give you the details right now. I'm a bit hazy. But that's how I can sum it up. So, Nkrumah was leading the negotiation with the British for independence. But these constituent parts of the Gold Coast were not all in agreement with what Nkrumah wanted to do. And that included Asante-Man that wanted its original empire back. And that's a legitimate political demand, is it not? Is it not? Yeah. It's a legitimate political demand that has to be taken into account in the context of the negotiation. So, how did Asante-Man get into the game? He got into the game starting with agitation about cocoa prices. We then morphed into a movement for Asante independence or restoration. Are you following my narrative? Right? And when it started, the Asante youth at the time were in the CPP. All the guys I've mentioned, Kobedufe, Dantua, Asafweje, I can name them. Jinkilejewu, Aram Ponsa, Victor Wusu, right? All of them were in the CPP. So, there was first the invocation of the Great Asante Oath. I don't know whether you're familiar with the Great Asante Oath.
Not really.
Right. But it was an oath, it was like a fatwa. You know what a fatwa is?
Yes.
You know what a fatwa is?
Yes, I do. I do.
Yeah. It said that any Asante youth who was inside the CPP had to resign, had to leave, or be regarded as a traitor to Asante-Man. That was what compelled the resignation of many of the guys I've mentioned. Victor Wusu, Aram Ponsa. So overnight, this activism that had powered the CPP was truncated, was reduced by the withdrawal of the Asante youth, who were now spearheading the movement for Asante restoration. Now, this important part of our history is carefully hidden from many people. From your expressions, it appears that you do not know this. Am I right?
Well, no, really. I've actually heard it over and over again, sitting as ghost of Alaji and Alaji. So those things don't miss they don't miss my ear.
Good. Now I'm talking. I'm painting a picture of a movement from the Gold Coast colony, from the born of 1844 to the former Gold Coast colony, declaration of colony. That does not include the part I've mentioned: Chebi, Kwewu, Asante, Bono and Hapo, northern region, upper east, upper west, Volta region, or large part of Volta region, Oti, they are not part of the original project. But if you do not understand the origins of the Gold Coast, at the time that Nkrumah was leading the agitation for independence, you don't understand the developments that have happened at the time and since. And those things are still with us till today. The rancor and the division that we find in our politics today has its roots in our history. Now, so the path forward, and let me summarize because I suspect that you don't have too much time.
Yeah.
To simplify things, the NLM was a representation, was a movement for Ashanti independence.
Okay.
Right? They rejected Nkrumah and the CPP and the idea of a unitary state, which will include states that were subject to them. Because the old empire included colony, included vassal state. You know what a vassal state is? Right? And what Ashanti man wanted was a simple matter to them. If the British are going, they should give back their land to them. That is, they should give back those territories in which they exercise what? Sovereignty and control. Not so.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you say when that failed, they turned to federalism?
So first of all, they wanted restoration.
Okay.
Then they morphed to secessionism.
Okay.
To succeed.
That's after independence?
No, this was all in the context of the negotiation for independence.
Okay.
All of this is happening in the context of the negotiation led by the CPP with the British for independence. For their own purposes, the British were also interested in a unitary state. Right? Although ideologically, they were on the side of Ashanti-man, for their own reasons, they were interested in a unitary state, the British. So they are on the side of Nkrumah on this one. But their preference at all material moments were for the people in the UGCC, etc., etc., etc. But that's another story. The point I'm making is that the Ashanti-man became the movement for Ashanti independence. And by independence, it meant the restoration of the old empire. If not, a succession of Ashanti. If not, Ashanti as part of the federation. Because you know what? The northern territories had also come into the equation. Okay? And at the height of its power, Ashanti exercised control over large parts of today's northern territory. Of course, Ghana was already part of Ashanti-man. And they exercised control over parts like Asin and Elmina. And all the coastal states, from Anglo through Ada, through the Ga, through the all the way to our western boundary, were under threat. So these were the issues that were being argued over, being contested. In some time past, they have been settled through war. Yeah, that's why an understanding of what it is that has brought us this far is critical.
Okay, but beyond that part he played in the early independence struggle, what did he become over the years before its passing?
The NLM became simpliciter a terrorist movement. It was engaged in terrorism against Nkrumah and the CPP to achieve the goals of Asante restoration, Asante independence, Asante succession. And ultimately, if they couldn't have all of those things, Asante federal, Asante as part of the federation. And in pursuit of those goals, they declared Asante and Kumasi a no-go area to the Prime Minister, Nkrumah.
Okay.
Right? They were exploding bombs. So, for instance, you know that we're starting from 1954. The NLM sponsored Buzia, okay, and Buzia became the arrowhead for their agitation in our legislature. It was Buzia that led the delegation to go and see the British, that they were in too much of a hurry to abandon the Gold Coast. Our independence should on no account be granted. If it was going to be granted to Ghana under the CPP led by Nkrumah. So this was a contestation. So they led a campaign of violence, of boycott, of bombing. Right? Now it was this campaign that first led Nkrumah, after the Declaration of Independence, to pass the law on the avoidance of discrimination. That banned the formation of parties on ethnic, sectarian, regional, religious lines. Okay? Are you following me?
Yes.
Yes. So this was in 1950, I believe it was in 57 or early 58. So the Avoidance of Discrimination Act immediately banned the NLM. It banned the Ghana Liberation Movement, the Gashifimo case. It banned the Muslim Association Party. It banned the Northern People's Party, NPP, etc., etc., etc. And literally forced all of them into the United Party. So you could almost say that the Nkrumah was the founder of the United Party. But important point has been made. When the United Party was founded at Bukum in Gamashi, it did not originally include the NLM. Because their fight was not, the fight of the other parties was not fight of the NLM. As I've laid out. Different parties wanted different things. The Gas was agitating for. That was the party of Bechabi Lampi. They were agitating for something different. What is it? This party by this guy who Buzi appointed as ambassador to Togo. I'm trying to collect the name. whose elements are now part of this so-called.
Is it the Anglo Youth Movement?
Yes. Okay. Because like I said, there are parties representing all the different parts of the Gold Coast then, agitating for their own solution as they saw fit. Yeah, which is legitimate.
Okay.
Now, what you do in such a context is that you have a negotiation involving all the parties. But the NLM was involved in a campaign of boycott and of terrorist attacks. There are attacks on Nkrumah. No, I'm sure you've heard of the bombing of his place at Malacca.
Mm-hmm.
That was an NLM. The NLM and the Gashibo were together at the head of all the terrorist attacks, all the way up to Kulungugu and the assassination attempt on Nkrumah. It was in the course of one of the assassination attempts on Nkrumah that J.B. Dankwa was arrested.
Okay.
And he was arrested with a prepared speech. Attempting to enter broadcasting house. But I think that Nkrumah made several mistakes. One of those mistakes was because of his sentimental relations with J.B. Dankwa. He would not put him on trial. Are you following my line?
Yes, Doc.
He would not put J.B. Dankwa on trial when he was arrested in the course of this assassination and overthrow attempt.
Look, the history lesson has been so profound, but you admitted a matter of time.
Back and forth.
Yes,
back and forth. I agree.
Yeah. So
I'm saying that simplicity, the NLM became a terrorist movement, in response to which Nkrumah first passed the Avoidance of Discrimination Act that bans parties like the NLM. Right? Of course, it does not stop NPP from becoming an ethnic party organized nationwide today. And that's another story.
So
then Nkrumah then passed the Preventive Detention Act.
Okay.
In response to the acts of terrorism led by the NLM and the Gashibo and parties like Tolimo. Are you following my drift?
Yes, I am.
Yes. And it was in that context that this issue of the Ray versus Akoto arose.
Okay.
Now, I think he was detained, right? And J.B. Dankwa was his lawyer who got a case for his being free. So we have the head of a movement for independence, for restoration of Asante-Man, that has been transformed into a terrorist organization, that has been arrested under the PDA. And you have a fight for its independence, simplicity.
Okay.
And if people are celebrating it today, you must see it for what it is about.
But they also cite that as perhaps a victory of rule of law.
Come again?
That particular decision, Ray versus Akoto, as a victory of rule of law.
You can interpret it whichever way you want. The point is simply this. Do states have any mechanism to defend themselves against terrorism? Do they? Do they?
Well, you have to create those mechanisms yourself.
So today, we don't have the Preventive Detention Act, right? Those who are celebrating Grey versus Akoto have the protective custody law.
Yeah.
All they did was to replace the heading, the title. Today in our laws, we have the Anti-Terrorism
Anti-Terrorism Act, yeah.
Passed by the government of Guinea Kufuor. You can take the name Anti-Terrorism Law or Act and insert in its place the PDA or the protective
custody law.
Custody decree. Yeah. You have not changed a bit.